Britain is now facing a geopolitical crisis unfolding far from Westminster, but with consequences that reach directly into the UK's national security strategy. Greenland, a remote and sparsely populated territory in the Arctic, has suddenly become one of the most sensitive flashpoints in global politics. And this time the pressure is not coming from Russia or China, but from the United States itself. European leaders are warning that what is happening could test NATO in ways the alliance has never faced before. For Britain, the stakes could hardly be higher. The UK is already involved. Britain has entered active discussions with NATO allies about strengthening security in the Arctic, including Greenland. UK officials describe these talks as part of ongoing defence planning, but the timing is impossible to ignore. These conversations follow repeated statements from US President Donald Trump, who has said the United States will take Greenland one way or the other. In response, London has made its position clear. Greenland's future must be decided by Greenlanders alone. Behind the scenes, British officials are now exploring how the UK could contribute to deterrence in the region without triggering a wider rupture inside NATO. That balance is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Denmark has delivered one of the strongest warnings heard from a NATO government in decades. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has described the situation as a fateful moment, saying that the idea of one NATO member threatening another challenges the very foundation of the alliance. Danish officials have stressed that Greenland is not for sale and not open to negotiation under pressure. Greenland's own leaders have echoed that message, stating clearly that they do not want to become American and do not wish to be controlled more tightly by Denmark. Their position is simple. Greenland belongs to its people. Britain, along with other European allies, has publicly rallied behind Denmark. Privately, officials are confronting a more unsettling reality, the possibility that NATO unity can no longer be assumed. For the UK, Greenland is not a distant or abstract issue. The island sits at the heart of the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, known as the GIUK gap, one of the most strategically important corridors in NATO defence planning. For decades, this region has been critical for tracking submarines, protecting Atlantic shipping lanes, and maintaining early warning systems. As Russia expands its Arctic military footprint and China describes itself as a near-Arctic power, British defence planners increasingly see Greenland as central to Europe's northern security. This is why Britain cannot afford to stay on the sidelines, even when the pressure comes from its closest ally. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is now confronting one of the most sensitive defence decisions any British leader can face: whether to deploy UK military forces to Greenland as part of a NATO operation. Senior officials have confirmed that Starmer is considering a range of military options, including the deployment of British troops, naval assets and surveillance aircraft. These discussions are being framed strictly within NATO structures, emphasising deterrence and reassurance rather than confrontation. Nonetheless, the political weight of the decision is considerable. This comes at a time when Britain's armed forces are already stretched. The UK has recently committed troops and funding to Ukraine, increased its naval presence in the North Atlantic, and continues to modernise its nuclear deterrent. Any move toward Greenland would require careful calibration, both militarily and politically. For Starmer, the dilemma is stark. Refusing to act could be interpreted as weakness or indecision at a moment when European allies are seeking leadership. Acting too decisively, however, risks inflaming tensions with Washington and placing Britain in direct opposition to its closest ally. Downing Street is therefore approaching the issue cautiously, seeking to preserve NATO unity while reinforcing the principle that territorial sovereignty cannot be challenged, even by a fellow NATO member. The troop question is not about provocation. It is about whether Britain is prepared to help uphold the alliance's rules when those rules are tested from within. That unpredictability is now driving the crisis. Donald Trump has escalated his rhetoric, stating openly that the United States will take Greenland the easy way or the hard way. He has refused to rule out military options and argues that Greenland is essential to US national security. He has also questioned whether NATO would come to America's aid if the US were attacked. That remark alone sent shockwaves through European capitals and forced allies to consider scenarios that were once unthinkable. Across Europe, the Greenland crisis has forced a conversation that many leaders hoped never to have. What happens if the United States can no longer be relied upon as NATO's anchor? Officials in Brussels, Berlin, Paris and London insist publicly that NATO remains strong. Privately, however, contingency planning has intensified. European defence officials are examining scenarios in which US leadership becomes unpredictable, inconsistent or openly confrontational toward allies. Proposals once considered politically unrealistic are now being discussed seriously. These include expanded European-led NATO missions in the Arctic, permanent multinational forces stationed in the High North, and greater coordination among EU member states outside US command structures. Some policymakers are also revisiting ideas for EU rapid reaction forces capable of operating independently if needed. For Britain, this discussion is especially delicate. The UK is no longer an EU member, but it remains one of Europe's most capable military powers and a central pillar of NATO. London's involvement is therefore critical, both as a contributor to European security and as a bridge to Washington. The underlying concern is not an imminent US withdrawal from NATO, but erosion. European leaders worry that if alliance norms are ignored once, they can be ignored again. Preparing for a post-US NATO is not about abandoning the alliance. It is about ensuring Europe is not left strategically exposed if unity breaks down. While NATO allies debate their next steps, Russia and China are watching closely. China has warned the United States not to use other countries as a pretext to pursue its own interests in Greenland. European analysts note that any fracture between the US and Europe immediately benefits rival powers. Division inside NATO weakens deterrence everywhere, from the Arctic to Eastern Europe and beyond. No serious policymaker believes the Greenland dispute is about to trigger a world war. But European security officials are increasingly willing to acknowledge that the conditions which make large-scale conflict more likely are quietly accumulating. World wars do not begin with declarations. They begin with fractures, in alliances, in trust, and in systems designed to prevent escalation. NATO was created precisely to avoid such breakdowns. That is why the Greenland crisis has unsettled leaders far beyond the Arctic. The danger lies not in intent, but in miscalculation. When rhetoric escalates, when military options are discussed openly, and when diplomatic norms are strained, the margin for error narrows. History shows that conflicts often emerge when leaders believe rules no longer apply, or when they assume rivals will back down. European officials are particularly concerned about precedent. If a powerful ally can pressure a smaller NATO member over territory, what message does that send elsewhere? In Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, and in the Indo-Pacific, such signals are closely watched. This is why references to World War III appear increasingly in strategic commentary, not as prediction, but as warning. The lesson drawn by European capitals is clear: preventing global conflict depends less on military strength than on alliance discipline. Greenland is not a battlefield, but how the crisis is handled may determine whether future disputes are resolved through diplomacy or drift towards something far more dangerous. Britain is no longer a bystander. It is a mediator, a military contributor, and a bridge between Europe and the United States. Keir Starmer's decisions in the coming weeks will shape Britain's role in NATO and possibly the alliance's future. Greenland may seem remote, but the consequences are not. If NATO cannot prevent confrontation between its own members, is the alliance entering its most dangerous chapter yet?